So now we're ready to install a carburetor on the bike. There's a groove on the throat of this carburetor that kind of goes in place and locks into a rib that's on the inside of the rubber piece that's on the engine. So we'll kind of work that in. And this is a little bit tricky to make sure that it's seated in there. So we're just going to kind of work it in. And you'll kind of feel it once it gets into the right spot. You'll kind of know where it's in there. And basically you got to make sure that it's in there so you don't have any air leaks. But anyway, that feels like it's pretty good to me. Now later on we'll tighten this clamp up and that'll hold everything in place. But for now I'm going to leave it loose so that we can move this around as we need to. Next up, I'm going to install the tube that connects the back of the carburetor to the air box that's over here. So the way this works is it's got sort of a longer side on one side of this flap and a shorter side. The shorter side with the groove in it goes into the air box, and this side with sort of the wider groove and the smaller end goes over the end of the carburetor. Now at one point in time there was sort of a spring clamp that fit into this groove. But that wore out, and I didn't replace it with a factory part. I ended up using this hose clamp, which holds everything together better, I think. So anyway, what I'm going to do is move that to the back, and you may be able to see this is wet. I've coated this with a little bit of WD-40. Maybe a little bit more would help, even a little bit better. But this now I'm going to put on the end of the carburetor, and this is a little bit tricky to get on there. I always have trouble getting this to kind of sit on there right. It just doesn't fit exactly the way you'd think it would, and then once it's on there it's real easy to pop off. So we'll get it on there and then we'll lock this clamp down. So I've got that seated on there, and I've got the flap, maybe you can't see it, but I've got the flap pointing straight up, and in the back of that double groove that's there, there is sort of a notch cut in that groove that lines up with a peg on the airbox. I'll try and show that in a minute. But now that I've got that on there, while I've got it on there, I'm going to take my hose clamp and I'm going to work this onto the end of the carburetor, and I'm going to tighten that up so it doesn't fall off. But I'm not going to tighten this up super tight because I may need to flex this and turn it a little bit. So I'm just going to try and get it to the point where it's snug so it won't pop off, but I can still rotate it if I need to. Okay, that ought to do it. It's on there tight, but I can move it a tiny bit if I need to. So next up I'm going to mount the air box to the carburetor, and the first thing I'm going to do is align this breather tube that's down at the bottom and just kind of push that on. That'll sort of help hold it in place. That's on there. It's a little tough to get to because of this bar right here, but I think I got it on there. So now what I'm going to do is try and get this rubber tube into the air box. Now this is much easier to do out on the bench, but then it's hard to get the tube onto the carburetor. So you're kind of fighting between a rock and a hard place here. I guess either way is maybe about the same amount of effort, but this is just the way that I chose to do it. So, so let's get this lined up here and we'll try and get it in. Basically what I got to do is just kind of squeeze this into the hole that's in the end of the air box so that the outer part of the lip seats in behind the airbox and the inner part seats outside of it. So the easier thing to do is to try and get that far end inserted first because I can't get my hand over there, and then just kind of push that around and get it in place, and that seems like it worked out okay. So this little nub then kind of sits into that groove that's there, and that's not really a mechanical feature. I think it's just a locator, so you know you've got everything lined up the right way. And now we can start putting the rear subframe back on the bike. Okay, let's see how this works. So I want to get this thing aligned here a bit so that this crossbar that's here goes underneath the airbox, sort of following the contour of the muffler, and that this top piece goes over the airbox. So let's just sort of slide this in place. And we're trying to do this without popping the airbox off of the end of the carburetor. So now the trick is, and I always forget this, that the muffler mounting ears go on the outside of the frame. It just naturally feels like you want to put it the other way, but that's how it goes. And now that I've got everything close, you can kind of see here that there are two hooks that are part of the subframe that go into these rubber slots in the back of the airbox. And that's sort of the last thing to do to kind of get everything in place. There we go. And that's actually what holds the back of the airbox up. And then the front of the airbox is held up by just one bolt right here, or one screw. But now that we've got that, I think everything is pretty close to being aligned. We'll have to fool with this a little bit to get it, perfect, but we're there. And one last thing to check before I start bolting everything in is to make sure that this rubber piece has still maintained its connection to the airbox and to the carburetor. I've got most of the hardware in place now that holds the subframe on, but I just have it loose and finger tight so that I can still adjust everything as I need to. This thing's a little bit funny to get aligned. So basically the things that hold this on are one bolt up here on the top of the airbox that goes into a threaded insert that's molded in the plastic. And then there's a couple of socket screws here and here that hold on the main part of the subframe. And then down here there's one bolt that goes through into a threaded boss on the bottom of the bike to hold on the support for the rear peg. This socket head screw has a threaded insert in the frame. This one here is a bolt and a nut. Anyway, these are symmetrical side to side, so the same hardware here, and here are on that side as well. The only difference is back here there's a couple of bolts, one here and one back here that hold on the muffler. So what I'll do now is just tighten everything up and then continue on with the reassembly. So next up I started routing the wiring harness and getting that in place. One thing I forgot was that there was a ground tab that needs to be mounted through the bolt that holds on the airbox. So I had to take that off, slip it through the ground tab, and put that back in place. Now before I reconnect this connector and this connector here, I'm going to put the airbox cover on. I really want to change this air filter, but I don't have a new one handy, so I'm just going to leave it as it is for now, just for a quick test. And I'll just put one of these on order and replace it when I get the new one in. Now on this side of the bike with the wiring harness, there was one connector to reconnect over here, right above where the battery would be. I don't have a battery in this bike. I haven't had it in here for years, but if you still have yours, you'll want to reconnect that and also hook your battery terminals back up. I've got mine cut and shrink tied off so that they won't make contact with anything. Now that that cover is in place, I can connect the wires for the wiring harness here. This connector used to have a locking tab on it, but it broke off at one point in the past. I don't think it can go backwards. I'll hook this up. And now we should be good with the wires. Next up, let's reconnect the throttle cables. I'll just snug these up so that they don't fall out. And then, I don't know if you guys can see it, but then this end of the cable will just need to go sort of in here and hook around. I guess it doesn't matter which way it goes in from. So it just goes through the slot and then turns up. And then same thing with this one, although. And then to make sure that we've got this the right way, we'll just test the throttle. And you can see I've got it backwards because I can't move that. So I did get it backwards. And yeah, now we've got it the right way. So now I can tighten these up, just make sure everything's sort of adjusted properly, and we should be good to go. Okay, now that I have the throttle cables tightened up, I think it's time to put the gas tank on. Okay, so I'm just going to drop this over the frame, and I'm going to line up the cups on the inside of the tank here with the rubber bosses to hold it in. I think I've got that. No, I don't. Okay, so that should be right about where it needs to be. It looks like everything in the back here is lined up. What I need to do now is route this overflow tube kind of crossways through the frame, but I want to make sure I don't pinch anything, so I got to kind of be careful with this. Okay, so the trick is to run this tube sort of through the bike, next to the carburetor, and down next to the overflow tube that's hooked up to the carburetor. It's a little tight in there, we just want to make sure that nothing gets pinched. So I've turned the bike around here just to make things a little easier for you guys. The next thing I need to do is remove this overflow tank. Now when I took the bike apart, I did have to take this off, but I put it back on just so that I didn't lose it. But now it needs to come off so we can reconnect the choke cable onto the carburetor. I almost forgot about that. You can see here I had to pull the tank off too. It was in the way. This is something I should have done before I put the tank on. But so here's the end of the choke cable, and this just goes into the carburetor. And then it's got this, I guess this is a plastic, I don't know if I want to call it a nut or a fitting. Maybe it's not plastic. Maybe it's metal. But either way, it goes into the carburetor. There's some threads there in the carburetor. So we'll just get that seated in. There's a little bit of spring tension on it, and it's a little tricky to get it started. But I think I've got it now. So I've got that about as tight as I can by hand. And I'm just going to try and get the rest of the way with a wrench. This is not the easiest thing to get to. I probably should have put this on before I even put the carburetor in. That probably would have been the easiest way to do this. Okay. Well, you may be able to see there, guys, I ended up breaking it. Those threads were plastic on there, and when I tried to get the wrench on a funny angle, it just didn't want to work right. So now this choke isn't really going to work right. We're so close on everything else. I'm just going to hook the tank up here real quick, and I guess we'll just see if we can get it running without the choke working properly. Okay, so we got that tightened up. There is an overflow tube on this, but I'm not sure where it went. I think it's been missing for a while now. So as you can hear, I've got the bike running. I didn't think I was going to be able to get it to run with the choke not working, but it took a few extra kicks, but I was able to get it going. And it is idling a little higher than it normally would, and I think that's because the choke is partially stuck on, and there's nothing I can do about that. But it seems to be running okay. I did do a quick lap around the yard. Throttle response seems good and everything, so I'm not sure if I'll even need to adjust that, that mixture screw. I think we may have it dialed in right where it needs to be. So I'll take a few more laps around, and then I'll park the bike. Obviously going to need to order that choke part for the choke cable, and I want to get another air filter for it anyway. But at least we've got the carburetor sorted out, and we know that the only thing wrong was the junk inside of it. As you guys saw, I broke the end of the choke cable while I was replacing it. So I'm going to have to go back and fix that at some point. So look for a video on that in an upcoming episode. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to leave a comment or subscribe, feel free to do that as well. Thanks for watching.